Hello, and welcome back to the 37th installment of Reconciling Zero as we go in search of Effective Zen. The question we posed last week was, can we come to really appreciate the Anattalakhana Sutta? Recall that as part of our quest to answer the question, is this Zen Mountain? We have recently been examining the notion of Zero Buddhism. Again, the requisite conditions needed for the activity of Buddhism to arise. Previously, we identified three such conditions. First, we need an enlightened teacher. Second, we need a clear picture of a path moving forward. Last, we need an understanding of the obstacles expected along this path. And over the last several weeks, we have summarized an effective teacher as one who recognizes that, at some level, all of us seek perfect certainty, which ultimately manifests as the realization of infinite mind, and which is invariably obstructed by a misreading of the self. And in looking at this notion of the self, last week we started an examination of the Buddha's second discourse, the Anattalakhana Sutta. The characteristics of not-self. Last week, we covered two critical foundational topics, namely the notion of the five aggregates and the Zen master Joshu Sasaki's teaching of zero. This week, we'll dig into the sutta. Hopefully, you've had a chance to read it. We can start by partitioning the discourse into 6 sections. The first section is the classic sutta prologue. The phrase, "Thus I have heard," is a pretty reliable indicator that this is a traditional sutta. The retelling of a discourse initially presented by the Buddha, and like most classic prologues, the narrator starts by describing where it occurred and who the audience is. In the second section, the Buddha argues that the 5 aggregates must be not self. Sounds simple enough, even if a bit confusing. You may want to reread this section. So what's all in here? First, the Buddha presents the notion of both a self and a not-self. As an aside, let's realize that the notion of both a self and a not-self is a natural outcome of the teaching that all phenomena are impermanent. Now, as the self is impermanent, it must have arisen from something called not-self. It must likewise cease, returning to something called not-self. Second, the Buddha implies that the 5 aggregates must be placed into one of these 2 self buckets. So if the aggregates are not part of the self, they must belong to the not-self and vice versa. Third, the Buddha recognizes that the 5 aggregates cannot be commanded. For example, try telling yourself to stop hearing, breathing, or feeling for the next 30 minutes. Last, because they cannot be commanded, the 5 aggregates can't be part of the self. That is, how could the self not command itself? And as they must go into one of the 2 self buckets, the 5 aggregates must be not self. And a final bit of subtlety here is the realization that the not-self can never even try to command the 5 aggregates, as there has to be a self to do the commanding. In the third section of the sutta, in using Sasaki's teaching that the I am self is the net result of 2 opposing activities called plus and minus, the Buddha argues that the plus activity, the this is mine, this I am activity, is unjustified. Here the Buddha recognizes that the 5 aggregates are impermanent and that such statements about impermanent entities can only lead to suffering. The implication here is that given correct understanding, the self would never intentionally act in a manner that leads to its own suffering. As with the last section, apparently the not-self never makes such claims, namely that this is mine, this I am. In the fourth section, as a corollary to the third, the Buddha states that one is justified in proclaiming about the individual aggregates that this is not mine, I am not this is not myself. And from Sasaki's teaching of zero, we recognize this self-talk as a minus activity. And by strengthening this minus activity through proper understanding, one ensures a prompt return from the I am self to the zero self. In the fifth section, the Buddha shows how the correct understanding of the self ultimately leads to enlightenment. According to the Buddha, the path unfolds as follows. A complete explanation of the relationship between the five aggregates and the self eventually leads to a detachment from the aggregates. This detachment eventually leads to a natural cycling between the self and not self, something we might call flow. And finally, fully reconciling this flow leads one to realize that nothing more is to be attained. And lastly, the sixth section is a bit of an epilogue, with the narrator describing the monks as actually manifesting the activity of not-self. The narrator finishes with, "And while this discourse was being spoken, the minds of the group of 5 mendicants was free from defilements by not grasping." So a lot of nuance built into such a short but essential discourse. So how about we finish with a couple of bullet points. First, Buddhism does not teach the unreality of the self. Second, Buddhism does teach that besides the self, there is something called the not-self. Third, the self inevitably arises and disappears. Not a good thing or a bad thing, it just is. Last, one should be constantly on the lookout for self-talk, centered around the 5 aggregates, as this self-talk invariably obstructs the natural cycling between the self and not-self. So, we now have a better understanding of the teaching of self. So where do we go from here? For next week, let's pause a moment and ask, can we now start to reconcile zero? And until next week, cheers!